This is Audible.
Penguin Audiobooks presents Assassin's Creed Black Flag by Oliver Bowden, read by Gunnar Corthery. Part 1. 1719, or thereabouts. I cut off a man's nose once. I don't recall exactly when it was, 1719 or thereabouts, nor where, but it happened during a raid on a Spanish brig. We wanted her supplies, of course. I pride myself on keeping the jackdaw well stocked, but there was something else on board too, something we didn't have but needed. Someone, to be precise. A ship's cook. Our own ship's cook and his mate were both dead. Cook's mate had been caught pissing in the ballast, which I didn't allow, so punished the traditional way, by making him drink a mug of the crew's piss. I must admit I've never had it happen before where the mug of punishment piss actually killed the man, but that's what happened with the cook's mate. He drank the mug of piss, went to sleep that night, and never got up. Cook was all right by himself for a time, but he did like a nip of rum, and after a nip of rum was apt to take the night air on the poop deck. I'd hear him clomping about on the roof of my cabin, dancing a jig. Until one night I heard him clomping about on the roof of my cabin and dancing a jig, followed by a scream and a splash. The bell rang and the crew rushed to the deck where we dropped anchor and lit lanterns and torches, but of Cook there was no sign. They had lads working with them, of course, but they were just boys. None of them knew how to do anything more culinary-minded than stir the pot or peel some spuds, and we've been living on raw grub ever since. Not a man among us knew how to do so much as boil a pot of water. Now, not long back we'd taken a man of war, a tasty little excursion from which we'd bagged ourselves a brand spanking new broadside battery and a hold full of artillery, cutlasses, pikes, muskets, pistols, powder and shot. From one of the captured crew, who then became one of my crew, I'd learnt that the Dons had a particular supply ship on which served an especially adept cook. Word was that he'd cooked at court but offended the Queen and been banished. I didn't believe a word of that, but it didn't stop me repeating it, telling the crew we'd have him preparing our meals before the week was out. Sure enough, we made it our business to hunt down this particular brig, and when we found it, lost no time in attacking it. Our new broadside battery came in handy. We drew up alongside and peppered the brig with shot till she broke, the canvas in tatters, and the helm splintered in the water. She was already listing as my crew lashed and boarded her, scuttling over her sides like rats, the air heavy with the stink of powder, the sound of muskets popping and cutlasses already beginning to rattle. I was in among them, as always, cutlass in one hand and my hidden blade engaged. The cutlass for melee work, the blade for close finishing. Two of them came at me, and I made short of the first, driving my cutlass into the top of his head and slicing his tricorn in half as the blade cleaved his head almost in two. He went to his knees with the blade of my sword between his eyes, but the problem was I'd driven it in too deep, and when I tried to wrench it free, his writhing body came with it. Now the second man was upon me, terror in his eyes. Not used to fighting, obviously, and with a flick of the blade I sliced off his nose, which had the desired effect of sending him back with blood spraying from the hole where his beak had been, while I used two hands to finally wrench my cutlass out of the skull of the first attacker and continue the good fight. It was soon over, with as few of their crew dead as possible, me having given out special instructions that on no account was the cook to be harmed. Whatever happened, I'd said, we had to take the cook alive. And as their brig disappeared beneath the water and we sailed away, leaving a fog of powder smoke and a sea of splintered hull and bobbing bits of broken ship behind us, we gathered their crew on the main deck to flush out the cook. Hardly a man among us not salivating, his belly not rumbling, the well-fed look of their crew not lost on us. Not at all. It was Caroline who taught me how to appreciate good food. Caroline, my one true love. In the all too brief time we'd spent together, she'd refined my palate, and I like to think that she'd have approved of my policy towards the repast, and how I'd passed on a love of the finer things to the crew, knowing as I did, partly due to what she'd shown me, that a well-fed man is a happy man, and a happy man is a man less prone to questioning the authority of the ship, which is why in all those years at sea I never had one sniff of mutiny. Not one. "Here I am," he said, stepping forward. Except it sounded more like, "Here I bam," owing to his bandaged face, where some fool had cut off his nose. 2. 1711. But anyway, where was I? Caroline. You wanted to know how I met her? Well, therein lies a tale, as they say. Therein lies a tale. For that I need to go much further back, to a time when I was just a simple sheep farmer, before I knew anything of assassins or Templars, of Blackbeard, Benjamin Hornigold, of Nassau or the Observatory, and might never have been any the wiser but for a chance meeting at the old Shillelagh one hot summer's day, back in 1711. The thing is, I was one of those young firebrands who liked to drink, even though it got me into a few scrapes. Quite a few incidents, shall we say, of which I'm none too proud. For that's the cross you have to bear if you're a little over-fond of the booze. It's rare to find a drinker with a clean conscience. Most of us will have considered knocking it on the head at one time or another, reforming our lives and perhaps turning to God or trying to make something of ourselves. But then noon comes around and you know what's good for that head is another drink, and so you head for the tavern. The taverns I'm referring to were in Bristol, on the southwest coast of dear old England, where we were accustomed to fierce winters and glorious summers. And that year, that particular year, the year that I first met her, 1711, like I say, I was just 17 years old. And, yes, I was drunk when it happened. In those days, you'd have to say I was drunk a lot of the time. Perhaps, well, let's not exaggerate, I don't want to give a bad account of myself, but perhaps half of the time. Maybe a bit more. Home was on the outskirts of a village called Hatherton, 7 miles outside Bristol, where we ran a small holding keeping sheep. Father's interests lay with the livestock, they always had, so having me on board had freed him from the aspect of the business he most despised, which was making the trips into town with the merchandise, haggling with merchants and traders, bargaining, cutting deals. As soon as I'd come of age, by which I mean as soon as I was enough of a man to meet the eye of our business associates and trade as an equal, well, that's what I did, and Father was all too glad to let me do it. My father's name was Bernard, my mother Lynette. They hailed from Swansea, but had found their way to the West Country when I was 10 years old. We still had the Welsh accent. I don't suppose I minded much that it marked us out as different. I was a sheep farmer, not one of the sheep. Father and Mother used to say I had the gift of the gab, and Mother in particular used to tell me I was a good-looking young man, and that I could charm the birds off the trees. And it's true, even though I do say so myself. I did have a certain way with the ladies. Let's put it this way, dealing with the wives of the merchants was a more successful hunting ground than having to barter with their husbands. How I spent my days would depend on the season. January to May, that was lambing season, our busiest time, when I'd find myself in the barns by sun-up, sore head or not, needing to see whether any ewes had lambed during the night. If they had, then they were taken into one of the smaller barns and put into pens, lambing jugs we called them, where Father would take over while I was cleaning feeders, filling them up again, changing the hay and water, and Mother would be assiduously recording details of the new births in a journal, Me? I didn't have my letters then. I do now, of course. Caroline taught me them, along with much else that made me a man. But not back then, so that duty fell to Mother, whose own letters weren't much better, but enough to at least keep a record. They loved working together, Mother and Father. Even more reason why Father liked me going into town. He and my mother, it was as though they were joined at the hip. I'd never seen another two people so much in love, and who had so little need to make a display of the fact. It was plain to witness that they kept each other going. It was good for the soul to see. In the autumn, we'd bring the rams through to the pasture to graze with the ewes, so that they could get on with the business of producing more lambs for the following spring. Fields needed tending to, fences and walls building and repairing. In winter, if the weather was very bad, we brought the sheep into the barns, kept them safe and warm, ready for January, when lambing season began. But it was during summer when I really came into my own. Shearing season. Mother and Father carried out the bulk of it, while I made more frequent trips into town, not with carcasses for meat, but with my cart laden with wool. And in the summer, with even more opportunity to do so, I found myself frequenting the local taverns more and more. You could say I became a familiar sight in the taverns, in fact, in my long buttoned-up waistcoat, knee breeches, white stockings, and the slightly battered brown tricorn that I like to think of as my trademark, because my mother said it went well with my hair, which was permanently in need of a cut, but quite a striking sandy colour if I do say so myself. It was in the taverns I discovered that my gift of the gab was improved after a few ales at noon. The booze, it has that effect, doesn't it? Loosens tongues, inhibitions, morals. Not that I was exactly shy and retiring when I was sober, but the ale, it gave me that extra edge. And after all, the money from extra sales made as a result of my ale-inspired salesmanship more than covered the cost of the ale in the first place. Or at least that's what I told myself at the time. And there was something else, too, apart from the foolish notion that Edward in his cups was a better salesman than Edward sober, and that was my state of mind. Because the truth was, I thought I was different. No, I knew I was different. There were times I'd sit by myself at night, and know I was seeing the world in a way that was all my own. I know what it is now, but I couldn't put it into words back then, other than to say I felt different. And either because of that, or despite it, I'd decided I didn't want to be a sheep farmer all my life. I knew it the first day when I set foot on the farm as an employee and not as a child, and I saw myself, and then looked at my father, and understood that I was no longer here to play, and would soon go home to dream about a future setting sail on the high seas. No, this was my future, and I would spend the rest of my life as a sheep farmer, working for my father, marrying a local girl, siring boys and teaching them to become sheep farmers, just like their father, just like their grandfather. I saw the rest of my life laid out for me, like neat work clothes on a bed, and rather than feel a warm surge of contentment and happiness about that fact, it terrified me. So the truth was, and there's no way of putting it more gently, and I'm sorry, Father, God rest your soul, but I hated my job. And after a few ales, well, I hated it less, is all I can say. Was I blotting out my dashed dreams with the booze? Probably. I never really thought about it at the time. All I knew was that sitting on my shoulder, perched there like a mangy cat, was a festering resentment at the way my life was turning out. Or worse, actually had turned out. Perhaps I was a little indiscreet concerning some of my true feelings. I might, on occasion, have given my fellow drinkers the impression that I felt life had better things in store for me. What can I say? I was young and arrogant and a pisshead, a lethal combination at the best of times. And these were definitely not the best of times. "You think you're above the likes of us, do you?" I heard that a lot, or variations of it at least. And perhaps it would have been more diplomatic of me to answer in the negative, but I didn't, and so I found myself in more than my fair share of fights. Perhaps it was to prove that I was better than them in all things, fighting included. Perhaps because in my own way I was upholding the family name. A drinker I might have been, a philanderer, arrogant, unreliable, but not a coward. Oh no, never one to shrink from a fight. And it was during the summertime when my recklessness reached its height, when I would be most drunk and most boisterous, and mainly a bit of a pain in the arse. But on the other hand, all the more likely to help a young lady in distress. Three. She was in the Old Shillelagh, a tavern halfway between Hatherton and Bristol, which was a regular haunt of mine, and sometimes in the summer, when mother and father toiled over the shearing at home, when I'd make more regular trips into town, regular to the tune of several times a day. I admit I hadn't taken much notice of her at first, which was unusual for me, because I like to pride myself on knowing the exact location of any pretty woman nearabouts, and besides, the Shillelagh wasn't the sort of place you expected to find a pretty woman. A woman, yes, a certain type of woman, but this girl I could see wasn't like that. She was young, about my age, and she wore a white linen coif and a smock. Looked to me like a domestic. But it wasn't her clothes that drew my attention. It was the loudness of her voice, which you'd have to say was in complete contrast to the way she looked. She was sitting with three men, all of them older than her, who I recognised at once. Tom Cobley, his brother Seth, and Julian somebody whose surname escaped me, but who worked with them. Three men with whom I had traded words, if not blows, before. The kind who looked down their noses at me because they thought I looked down my nose at them, who liked me no more than I liked them, which was not a lot. They were sat forward on their stools and watching this young girl with leering, wolfish eyes that betrayed a darker purpose, even though they were all smiles, thumping on the table, encouraging her as she drank dry a flagon of ale. No, she did not look like one of the women who usually frequented the tavern, but it seemed she was determined to act like one of them. The flagon was about as big as she was, and as she wiped her hand across her mouth and hammered it to the table, the men responded with cheers, shouting for another one and no doubt pleased to see her wobble slightly on her stool. Probably couldn't believe their luck. Pretty little thing like that. I watched as they let the girl drink yet more ale with the same tumult accompanying her success, and then as she did the same as before and wiped her hand across her mouth, but with an even more pronounced wobble this time, a look passed between them. A look that seemed to say, the job is done. Tom and Julian stood, and they began, in their words, to escort her to the door, because, "You've had too much to drink, my lovely. Let's get you home, shall we?" "To bed," smirked Seth, thinking he was saying it under his breath, even though the whole tavern heard him. "Let's be getting you to bed." I passed a look to the barman, who dropped his eyes and used his apron to blow his nose. A customer sat down the bar from me, turned away. Bastards. Might as well have looked to the cat for help, I thought. Then with a sigh banged down my tankard, stepped off my stool, and followed the Cobleys into the road outside. I blinked as I stepped from the darkness of the tavern into bright sunlight. My cart was there, roasting in the sun. Beside it another one that I took to belong to the Cobleys. On the other side of the road was a yard with the house set far back, but no sign of a farmer. We were alone on the highway. Just me, the two Cobley brothers, Julian, and the girl, of course. Well, Tom Cobley, I said, the things you see on a fine afternoon. Things like you and your cronies getting drunk and getting a poor defenceless young woman even drunker. The girl sagged as Tom Cobley let go of her arm and turned to address me, his finger already raised. Now just you stay out of this, Edward Kenway, you young good-for-nothing. You're as drunk as I am and your morals just as loose. I don't need to be given a talking to by the likes of you. Seth and Julian had turned as well. The girl was glazed over, like her mind had gone to sleep, even if her body was still awake. Well, I smiled, loose morals I might have, Tom Cobley, but I don't need to pour ale down a girl's throat before taking her to bed, and I certainly don't need two friends to help me at the task. Tom Cobley reddened. Why, you cheeky little bastard, you, I'm going to put her on my cart is what I'm going to do and take her home. I've no doubt that you intend to put her on your cart and take her home. It's what you plan to do between putting her on the cart and reaching home that concerns me. That concerns you, does it? A broken nose and a couple of broken ribs will be concerning you unless you mind your own bloody business. Squinting, I glanced at the highway where the trees bordering the dirt track shone gold and green in the sun, and in the distance was a lone figure on a horse, shimmering and indistinct. I took a step forward, and if there had been any warmth or humour in my manner, then it disappeared now almost of its own accord. There was a steeliness in my voice when I next spoke. Now you just leave that girl alone, Tom Cobley, or I won't be responsible for my actions. The three men looked at one another. In a way, they'd done as I asked. They'd let go of the girl, and she seemed almost relieved to slide to her haunches, placing one hand on the ground and looking at us all with bleary eyes, evidently oblivious to all this being discussed on her behalf. Meanwhile, I looked at the Cobleys and weighed up the odds. Had I ever fought three at once? Well, no. Because if you were fighting three at once, then you weren't so much fighting as getting beaten up. But come on, Edward Kenway, I told myself. Yes, on the one hand, it was three men, but one of them was Tom Cobley, who was no spring chicken, but about my father's age. Another one was Seth Cobley, who was Tom Cobley's son. And if you can imagine the kind of person who would help his father get a young girl drunk, well, then you can imagine the sort of person Seth Cobley was, which was to say a maggoty, underhand type, more likely to run away from a fight with wet breeches than stand his ground. And what's more, they were drunk. On the other hand, I was drunk too. Plus, they had Julian, who, going on looks alone, could handle himself. But I had another idea. That lone rider I could see in the distance. If I could just hold off the Cobleys till he arrived, the odds were likely to shift back in my favour. After all, if he was a good character, the lone rider was bound to stop and help me out. Well, Tom Cobley, I said, you got the advantage over me, that's obvious for anyone to see. But, you know, I just wouldn't be able to look my mother in the eye knowing I'd let you and your cronies abduct this pretty young thing. I glanced up the road to where that lone rider was getting closer. Come on then, I thought. Don't hang about. So, I continued, even if you end up leaving me in a bloody heap by the side of this here road and carry that young lassie off anyway, I'm going to have to do all that I can to make it as difficult for you as possible. And perhaps see to it that you go on your way with a black eye and maybe a pair of throbbing bollocks for your troubles. Tom Cobley spat, then peered at me through wizened, slitty eyes. That's it then, is it? Well, you're just going to stand there talking about it all day, or are you going to attend to your task? Because time waits for no man. He grinned an evil grin. I've got things to see, people to do. Aye, that's right, and the longer you leave it, the more chance that poor lassie has of sobering up, eh? I don't mind telling you, I'm getting tired of all this talk, Kenway. He turned to Julian. How about we teach this little bastard a lesson? Oh, and one more thing before we start, Master Kenway. You ain't fit to shine your mother's shoes, you understand? That hit me hard, I don't mind admitting. Having someone like Tom Cobley, who had all the morals of a frothing dog and about half the intelligence, able to reach into my soul as if my guilt was an open wound, then stick his thumb in that open wound and cause me even more pain, well, it certainly firmed up my resolve, if nothing else. Julian pushed his chest forward and with a snarl advanced. 2 steps away from me, he raised his fists, dipped his right shoulder and swung. And I don't know who Julian was used to fighting outside taverns, but somebody with less experience than me, that's for sure, because I'd already taken note of the fact that he was right-handed, and he couldn't have made his intentions more obvious if he'd tried. The dirt rose in clouds around my feet as I dodged easily and brought my own right fist up sharply. He shouted in pain as I caught him under the jaw, and if it had just been him, the battle would have been won. But Tom Cobley was already upon me. From the corner of my eye I saw him, but was too late to react, and next thing you know, I was dazed by knuckles that slammed into my temple. I staggered slightly as I swung to meet the attack, and my fists were swinging much more wildly than I'd have liked. I was hoping to land a lucky blow, needing to put at least one of the men down to even up the numbers. But none of my punches made contact as Tom Cobley retreated, plus Julian had recovered from my first strike with alarming speed, and now came at me again. His right fist came up and connected with my chin, spinning me about so that I almost lost my balance. My hat flew off, my hair was in my eyes, and I was in disarray. And guess who came in with his boots kicking? That worm, Seth Cobley, shouting encouragement to his father and Julian at the same time. And the little bastard was lucky. His boot caught me in the midriff, and already off balance I lost my footing, and fell. The worst thing you can do in a fight is fall. Once you fall, it's over. Through their legs I saw the lone rider up the highway, who was now my only chance at salvation, possibly my only hope of getting out of this alive. But what I saw made my heart sink. Not a man on a horse, a tradesman who would dismount and come rushing to my aid. No, the lone rider was a woman. She was riding astride the horse, not side saddle, but despite that you could see she was a lady. She wore a bonnet and a light-coloured summer dress, and the last thing I thought before the Cobley boots obscured my view, and the kicks came raining in, was that she was beautiful. So what, though? Good looks weren't going to save me now. Hey, I heard. You 3 men. Stop what you're doing right now. They turned to look up at her and removed their hats, shuffling in line to hide the sight of me, who lay coughing on the ground. What is going on here? She demanded to know. From the sound of her voice I could tell she was young and, while not highly born, definitely well-bred. Too well-bred, surely, to be riding unaccompanied. We were just teaching this young man here some manners, rasped Tom Cobley, out of breath. Exhausting business it was, kicking me after death. Well, it doesn't take 3 of you to do that, does it? She replied. I could see her now, twice as beautiful as I'd first thought, as she glowered at the Cobleys, who for their part looked thoroughly mortified. She dismounted. More to the point, what are you doing with this young lady here? She indicated a girl who still sat dazed and drunk on the ground. Oh, ma'am, begging your pardon, ma'am, but this is a young friend of ours who's had too much to drink. The lady darkened. She is most certainly not your young friend. She is a maidservant, and if I don't get her back home before my mother discovers she's absconded, then she will be an unemployed maidservant. She looked pointedly from one man to the next. I know you men, and I think I understand exactly what has been going on here. Now you will leave this young man alone and be on your way before I am of a mind to take this further." With much bowing and scraping, the Cobleys clambered aboard their cart and were soon gone. Meanwhile, the woman dismounted and knelt down to speak to me. Her voice had changed. She was softly spoken now. I heard concern. "My name is Caroline Scott. My family lives on Hawkins Lane in Bristol. Let me take you back there and tend to your wounds." "I cannot, my lady," I said, sitting up and trying to manage a grin. "I have work to do." She stood, frowning. "I see. And did I assess the situation correctly?" I picked up my hat and began to brush the dirt from it. It was even more battered now. "You did, my lady." "Then I owe you my thanks, and so will Rose when she sobers up. She's a wilful girl, not always the easiest of staff, but nevertheless, I don't want to see her suffer for her impetuousness." She was an angel, I decided then, and as I helped them mount the horse, Caroline holding on to Rose, who lolled drunkenly over the neck of the horse, I had a sudden thought. "Can I see you again, my lady? To thank you properly when I look a little more presentable, perhaps?" She gave me a regretful look. "I fear my father would not approve," she said, and with that shook the reins and left. That night I sat beneath the thatch of our cottage, gazing out over the pastures that rolled away from the farm as the sun went down. Usually my thoughts would be of escaping my future. That night I thought of Caroline. Caroline Scott of Hawkins Lane. 4. 2 days later I woke up to the sound of screaming. In a rush I dragged my breeches on and hopped out of the room with my shirt unbuttoned, still pulling my boots on over bare feet. I knew that scream. It was my mother. Moments later her screams had died down to a sob, replaced by my father cursing. The soft cursing of a man who had been proved correct. After my fight at the old Shillelagh, I had returned to the tavern in order to do something about my cuts and bruises, to numb the pain, so to speak. And what better way of doing that than with a drink or two? Thus, when I'd eventually arrived home, I'd been in a bit of a state. And when I say state, I mean state, as in a man who looked as though he'd been in the wars, which I had. Bruises to my face, my neck, my clothes ragged and torn. But also state, as in a man who had had far too much to drink. Either one of these two things were likely to make Father angry, so we'd argued, and I'm ashamed to say I used some choice language in front of my mother. And of course Father was furious about that, and I felt the back of his hand for it. But what had really enraged him was that the brawl, as he called it, because he wouldn't accept that I'd been protecting a lady's honour, and that he would have done the same in my position, had all taken place during the working day. What he saw was them, exhausted from their labours, and me getting drunk and into fights, sullying the good name of the Kenways, and in this particular case, storing up even more trouble for the future. The Cobleys! He'd thrown up his hands in exasperation. "That lot of bad bloody eggs," he'd said. "It would have to be them, wouldn't it? They won't let it go, you know that, don't you?" Sure enough, I rushed out to the front yard that morning, and there was Father in his work clothes, comforting Mother, who stood with her head buried in his chest, sobbing quietly, her back to what was on the ground. My hand went to my mouth, seeing what had greeted them. 2 slaughtered sheep, their throats cut, laid side by side in the blood-darkened dust. They'd been placed there so we'd know they weren't the victims of a fox or wild dog, so that we'd know the sheep had been killed for a reason, a warning. Vengeance. The Cobleys, I spat, feeling rage bubble like fast-boiling water within me. With it came a sharp, stinging guilt. We all knew it was my actions that had caused this. Father didn't look at me. On his face was all the sadness and worry you'd expect. Like I say, he was a well-respected man, and he enjoyed the benefits of that respect. His relations, even with his competitors, were conducted with courtesy and respect. He didn't like the Cobleys, of course he didn't. Who did? But he'd never had trouble before, either with them or anyone else. This was the first time. This was new to us. "I know what you're thinking, Edward," he said. He couldn't bear to look at me, I noticed. He just stood holding Mother with his eyes fixed on some point in the distance. "But you can think again." "What am I thinking, Father?" "You're thinking it's you who has brought this upon us. You're thinking about having it out with the Cobleys." "Well, what are you thinking? Just let them get away with it?" I indicated the 2 bleeding corpses on the dirt. Livestock destroyed, livelihood lost. They have to pay. "It can't be done," he said simply. "What do you mean it can't be done?" 2 days ago I was approached to join an organisation. A trade organisation, it was called. When I looked at my father, I wondered if I was seeing an older version of myself, and may God strike me down for thinking it, but I fervently hoped not. He'd been a handsome man once, but now his face was lined and drawn. The wide brim of his felt hat covered eyes that were always turned down and tired. "They wanted me to join," he continued, "but I said no. Like most of the tradesmen in the area, the Cobleys have said yes. They enjoy the protection of the trade organisation, Edward. Why else do you think they would do something so ruthless? They're protected." I closed my eyes. "Is there anything we can do?" "We continue as before, Edward, and hope that this is an end to it, that the Cobleys will feel their honour has been restored." He turned his tired old eyes on me for the first time. There was nothing in them, no anger or reproach, only defeat. "Now can I trust you to get this cleared up while I see to your mother?" "Yes, Father," I said. He and Mother made their way back into the cottage. "Father," I called as they reached the door, "why didn't you join the trade organisation?" "You'll learn one day, if you ever grow up," he said, without turning. 5. In the meantime, my thoughts returned to Caroline. The first thing I did was find out who she was, and by asking around Hawkins Lane I learnt that her father, Emmett Scott, was a wealthy merchant dealing in tea, who would no doubt have been seen as new money by most of his customers, but nevertheless seemed to have inveigled himself into high society. Now a man less headstrong than myself, less cocksure, might well have chosen a different path to Caroline's heart than the one I opted for. After all, her father was a supplier of fine teas to the well-to-do households in the West Country. He had money, enough to employ servants at a good-sized house on Hawkins Lane. No smallholder he, no getting up at 5 a.m. to feed the livestock for him. He was a man of means and influence. What I should have done, even knowing it would be futile, was try to make his acquaintance. And much of what subsequently happened, so much, could have been avoided if I had at least tried. But I didn't. I was young, you see, and no wonder the likes of Tom Cobley hated me. I was so arrogant. Despite my social status, I thought currying favour with a tea merchant was below me. Now, one thing I know is that if you love women, which I do, I'm not ashamed to say, you find something of beauty in every woman, no matter whether or not they're what you might call classically beautiful. But with Caroline it was my misfortune to fall in love with a woman whose outer beauty matched the inner. And of course her charms were likely to catch the attention of others. So the next thing I discovered about her was that she had caught the eye of Matthew Haig, son of Sir Aubrey Haig, Bristol's biggest landowner, and an executive in the East India Company. From what I gathered, young Matthew was our age, and as self-important and jumped up as they come, thinking himself much more than he was. He liked to wear the air of a shrewd businessman like his father, though it was clear he possessed none of his father's aptitude in that area. What's more, he liked to think himself something of a philosopher, and often dictated his thoughts to a draftsman who accompanied him wherever he went, pen and ink at the ready to write down, whatever the circumstances, Haig's thoughts, such as, "A joke is a stone tossed into water, laughter the ripples it makes." Perhaps his utterings were deeply profound. All I know is that I wouldn't have paid him much mind. Indeed, I would have joined in with the general derision and laughter that seemed to accompany mention of his name, if it hadn't been for the fact that he'd showed an interest in Caroline. Perhaps even that wouldn't have worried me so much, but for two other factors. That Caroline's father, Emmett Scott, had apparently betrothed Caroline to the Haig boy, and also the fact that the Haig boy, possibly on account of his condescending manner, his tendency to make vital mistakes in even the most simple business dealings, and his ability to wind people up, had a minder, a man named Wilson, who was an uncultured brute of a man, but very big, with one slightly closed-up eye, who was said to be tough. "Life is not a battle, for battles are there to be won or lost. Life is to be experienced," Matthew Haig had been heard to dictate to his skinny draftsman. Well, of course, for Matthew Haig there was precious little battling going on. Firstly, because he was the son of Sir Aubrey Haig, and, secondly, he had a dirty great minder following him everywhere. So anyway, I made it my business to find out where Caroline would be one sunny afternoon. How? Well, that was a case of calling in a favour, you could say. You remember Rose, the maidservant I'd helped save from a fate worse than death? Well, I reminded her of that fact one day when I followed her from Hawkins Lane to the market, and then, as she made her way through the stalls, deftly avoiding the shouts of the stall-holders with a basket in the crook of her arm, made my introductions. She didn't recognise me, of course. "I'm sure I have no idea who you are, sir," she said, with little startled eyes darting in all directions, as though her employers might come a-leaping from the aisles between the stalls. "Well, I know exactly who you are, Rose," I said. "And it was me who took a beating on your behalf outside the old Shillelagh last week. Drunk as you were, you remember the presence of a good Samaritan, I hope?" She nodded reluctantly. And yes, perhaps it's not the most gentlemanly thing to do, to use a young lady's unfortunate circumstances in such a mercenary fashion to, well, I wouldn't go as far as to say blackmail, but as leverage. But there we have it. I was smitten, and given that my penmanship skills were none too clever, had decided that a face-to-face encounter with Caroline was the best way to begin the process of winning her heart. Charm the birds out the trees, see? Well, it worked on traders, and on the occasional young lady I encountered in the taverns. Why not on someone of high-born stock? From Rose I learned that Caroline enjoyed taking the air at the Bristol docks on a Tuesday afternoon. But, she said, with a quick look left to right, I should be wary of Mr. Haig, him and his manservant, Wilson. Mr. Haig was most keen on Caroline, so Rose said, and was very protective of her. So it was that the following morning I made sure I took a trip into town, moved my goods as quickly as possible, and then made my way down to the harbour. There the air was thick with the scent of sea salt and manure and boiling pitch, and rang to the cries of seagulls, as well as the endless shouts of those who made the docks their place of work, crews calling to one another as they loaded and unloaded ships whose masts rocked slightly in the gentle breeze. I could see why Caroline might like it here. All life was on the harbour, from the men with baskets of freshly picked apples or pheasants hanging on twine round their necks, to the tradesmen who merely deposited baskets on the quayside and hollered at visiting deckhands, and the women with fabric persuading Jack Tars they were getting a bargain. There were children who had flowers or tinder to sell, or who ran through the legs of sailors and dodged the traders, almost as anonymous as the dogs that slunk around the harbour walls and snuffled at the piles of rubbish and rotting food swept there from the day before. Among them all was Caroline, who, with a bow in her bonnet and a parasol over one shoulder, with Rose a respectful few feet behind her, looked every inch the lady. And yet I noticed I kept my own distance for the time being, needing to choose my moment. She didn't look down her nose at the activity around her, as she so easily could have done. From her demeanour I could tell that she, like me, enjoyed seeing life in all its forms. I wondered, did she also, like me, ever look out to a sea that glittered with treasure, masts of ships tilting gently, gulls flying towards where the world began, and wonder what stories the horizons had to tell? I am a romantic man, it's true, but not a romantic fool, and there have been moments since that day outside the tavern when I'd wondered if my growing affections for Caroline were not partly an invention of my mind. She had been my saviour after all, but now, as I walked along the harbour, I fell for her anew. Did I expect to speak to Caroline in my sheep farmer's clothes? Of course not. So I'd taken the precaution of changing, trading my dirty boots for a pair of silver-buckled shoes, neat white stockings and dark breeches, a freshly laundered waistcoat over my shirt, and a matching three-cornered hat instead of my trusty brown one. I looked quite the gentleman, if I do say so myself. I was young, good-looking, and full of confidence, the son of a well-respected tradesman in the area, a Kenway. The name had something at least, despite my attempts otherwise, and I also had with me a young scallywag by the name of Albert, who I had bribed to do a job for me. It doesn't take much grey matter to guess the nature of the job. He was to help me impress the fair Caroline. One transaction with a flower girl later, and I had the means to do it, too. Right, you remember the plan, I told Albert, who looked up at me from beneath the brim of his hat with eyes that were so much older than his years, and a bored, heard-it-all-before look on his face. Right, mate, you're to give this spray of flowers to that fine-looking lady over there. She will stop. She will say to you, "Ah, young fellow, for what reason are you presenting me with these flowers?" And you will point over here. I indicated to where I would be standing, proud as a peacock. Caroline would either recognise me from the other day, or at the very least wish to thank her mysterious admirer and instruct Albert to invite me over, at which point the charm offensive would begin. "And what's in it for me?" asked Albert. "What's in it for you? How about counting yourself lucky I don't give you a thick ear?" He curled a lip. "How about you taking a running jump off the side of the harbour?" "All right," I said, knowing when I was beaten. "There's half a penny in it for you." "Half a penny? Is that the best you can do?" "As a matter of fact, Sonny Jim, it is the best I can bloody do. And for walking across the harbour and presenting a flower to a beautiful woman, it's also the easiest halfpenny's work there ever was." "Ain't she got a suitor with her?" Albert craned his neck to look. And of course it would soon become apparent exactly why Albert wanted to know whether Caroline had an escort. But at that particular moment I took his interest for nothing more than curiosity, a bit of chit-chat, some idle conversation. So I told him that no, she had no suitor, and I gave him the spray of flowers and his halfpenny and sent him on his way. It was as he sauntered over that something he was holding in his other hand caught my eye, and I realised what a mistake I'd made. It was a tiny blade, and his eyes were fixed on her arm where her purse hung on a ribbon. Oh, God, a cut purse. Young Albert was a cut purse. "You little bastard," I said under my breath, and immediately set off across the harbour after him. By now he was halfway between us, but being small was able to slip between the seething crowds more quickly. I saw Caroline, oblivious to the approaching danger that I had inadvertently sent into her path. The next thing I saw were 3 men who were also making their way towards Caroline. 3 men I recognised: Matthew Haigh, his skinny writing companion, and his minder, Wilson. Inwardly I cringed. Even more so when I saw Wilson's eyes flick from Caroline to Albert and then back again. He was good, you could tell. In a heartbeat he had seen what was about to happen. I stopped. For a second I was totally flummoxed. Didn't know what to do next. "Oi!" shouted Wilson, his gruff tones cutting across the endless squawking, chatting, hawking of the day. "Oi, you!" And he surged forward. But Albert had reached Caroline, and in one almost impossibly fast and fluid gesture, his hand snaked out, the ribbon of Caroline's purse was cut, and the tiny silk bag dropped neatly into Albert's other hand. Caroline didn't notice the theft, but she couldn't fail to see the huge figure of Wilson bearing down upon her, and she cried out in surprise, even as he lunged past her and grabbed Albert by the shoulders. "This young rapscallion has something that belongs to you, miss," roared Wilson, shaking Albert so hard that the silk purse dropped to the harbour floor. Her eyes went to the purse and then to Albert. "Is this true?" she said, though the evidence was in front of her eyes, and in fact currently sat in a small pile of horse manure by their feet. "Pick it up! Pick it up!" Haigh was saying to his skinny companion, having just arrived and already beginning to behave as though it was he who had apprehended the knife-wielding youth, and not his 6.5-foot minder. "Teach the young ruffian a lesson, Wilson." This was Haigh waving his hand as though attempting to ward off some especially noxious flatulence. "With pleasure, sir." There was still several feet between me and them. He was held fast, but Albert's eyes swivelled from looking terrified at Wilson to where I stood in the crowd, and as our eyes met he stared at me beseechingly. I clenched my teeth. That little bastard! He had been about to ruin all of my plans, and now he was looking to me for help. The cheek of him! But then Wilson, holding him by the scruff of the neck with one hand, drove his fist into Albert's stomach, and that was it for me. That same sense of injustice I had felt at the tavern was reignited, and in a second I was shoving through the crowd to Albert's aid. "Hey!" I shouted. Wilson swung to see me, and though he was bigger than me, and far uglier than me, I'd just seen him hit a child, and my blood was up. It's not an especially gentlemanly way to conduct a fight, but I knew from experience, both as giver and receiver, that there was no quicker and cleaner way to put a man down. So I did it. I led with the knee. My knee into his bollocks, to be precise. So quick and so hard that where one second Wilson was a huge snarling bully about to meet my attack, the next he was a snivelling, mewling heap of a man, his hands grasping at his groin as he landed on the floor. Heedless of Matthew Haigh's outraged screaming, I grabbed Albert. "Say sorry to the lady," I ordered him, with a finger in his face. "Sorry, miss," said Albert obediently. "Now hop it," I said, and pointed him off down the harbour. He needed no second invitation, and in a trice was gone, prompting even more protestations from Matthew Haigh, and I thanked God that at least Albert was out of the picture and unable to dob me in. I had saved Albert from getting a worse beating, but my victory was short-lived, and I certainly didn't get the time to enjoy it. Wilson was already on his feet, and though his bollocks must have been throbbing something rotten, he wasn't feeling anything at that moment except rage. He was quick, too, and before I had time to react, had grabbed me and was holding me firm. I tried to pull away, dipping one shoulder and driving my fist up towards his solar plexus, but I didn't have the momentum, and he used his body to block me, grunting as much with satisfaction as with the effort, as he dragged me bodily across the harbour, people scattering before him. In a fair fight I would have had a chance, but he used his superior strength and his sudden rage-fueled spurt of speed to his advantage, and in the next moment my feet were kicking in thin air as he flung me off the side of the harbour. Well, I had always dreamed of taking to the high seas, and with the sound of laughter ringing in my ears, I pulled myself to the nearest rope ladder and began to climb out. Caroline, Rose, Haig, and his 2 men had already gone. I saw a hand reach down to help me up. "Here, mate, let me help you with that," said a voice. I looked up gratefully, about to clasp the hand of my Samaritan, only to see the leering face of Tom Cobley peering over the harbour's edge at me. "Well, the things you see when you're out without your musket," he said, and there was nothing I could do to prevent his fist smashing into my face, sending me off the rope ladder and back into the water. 6. Tom Cobley had made himself scarce, but Wilson must have doubled back. Chances are he saw to it that Haig and Caroline were okay, and then made haste back to the harbour and found me sitting on a set of steps licking my wounds. He passed across my light, and I looked up to see him, heart sinking. "If you've come back to try that again," I said, "I won't make it quite so easy for you this time." "I have no doubt," he replied without so much as flinching. "But I'm not here to pitch you back in the sea, Kenway." At that, I looked sharply at him. "That's right, boy. I have my spies. And my spies tell me that a young gentleman by the name of Edward Kenway has been asking questions about Caroline Scott. This same young gentleman by the name of Edward Kenway was involved in a fight outside the Old Shillelagh on the road to Hatherton last week. That same day, Miss Scott was also on the road to Hatherton because her maidservant had absconded, and that you and Miss Scott had cause to speak following your altercation." He came so close I could smell the stale coffee on his breath. Proof, if proof were needed, that he wasn't in the slightest bit intimidated, not by me nor by my fearsome reputation. "Am I on the right line so far, Master Kenway?" "You might be." He nodded. "I thought so. How old are you, boy?" "What, 17? About the same age as Miss Scott? Methinks you're nurturing a bit of a passion for her, am I right?" "You might be." "I think I am. Now I'm going to say this once and once only, but Miss Scott is promised to Mr. Haig. This union has the blessing of the parents." He hauled me to my feet, pinning my arms to my sides. Too wet, too bedraggled, too exhausted to resist. I knew what was coming anyway. "Now if I see you hanging around her again, or trying any more stupid stunts to try to get her attention, then it'll be more than a dip in the sea you get. Do I make myself clear?" I nodded. "And what about the knee and the ghoulies you're about to give me?" He smiled grimly. "Oh, that? That's personal." He came good on his word. It was some time before I was able to get to my feet and make my way back to my cart. It wasn't just my tackle that was injured. My pride had taken a beating too. 7. That night I lay in bed, cursing my luck. I had blown my chances with Caroline. She was lost to me, all thanks to that greedy urchin Albert, not to mention Haig and company. I had suffered once more at the hands of Tom Cobley, and father had looked at me askance when I'd arrived home a little later than usual, and even though I had had a change of clothing, a little more bedraggled into the bargain. "You've not been in those taverns again," he said darkly. "So help me God if I hear you've been dragging our good name—" "No, father, nothing like that." He was wrong. I'd not been to the tavern on my way home. In fact, I'd not gone within sniffing distance of an alehouse since the fight outside the Old Shillelagh. I'd been telling myself that meeting Caroline had had an effect on me. Quite literally, a sobering effect. Now, though, I didn't know. I began to wonder. Perhaps my life was there, in the beer suds, around the sloppy grins of easy women, with hardly any teeth and even fewer morals. and by the time of my 30th summer hauling wool to Bristol Market, I'd be numb to it. I'd have forgotten whatever hopes I had of one day seeing the world. Gradually the lure of the taverns asserted itself once more. And then two things happened that changed everything. The first came in the shape of a gentleman who took his place next to me at the bar of the George and Dragon, in Bristol, one sunny afternoon. A smartly dressed gentleman with flamboyant cuffs and a colourful necktie, who removed his hat, placed it on the bar, and indicated my drink. "Can I get you another, sir?" he asked me. It made a change from son, lad, or boy, all of which I had to endure on a daily, if not hourly, basis. "And who do I have to thank for my drink? And what might he want in return?" I asked guardedly. "Perhaps just the chance to talk, friend," beamed the stranger. He proffered his hand to shake. "The name is Dylan Wallace. Pleased to make your acquaintance, Mr. Kenway, isn't it?" For the second time in a matter of days I was presented with someone who knew my name, though I had no idea why. "Oh, yes," he said, beaming. He was at least of a more friendly nature than Wilson, I reflected. "I know your name." "Edward Kenway. Quite the reputation you have around these parts. Indeed, I've seen you in action for myself." "Have you?" I looked at him, eyes narrowed. "Why, yes, indeed," he said. "I hear from the people I've spoken to that you're no stranger to a bit of a ruck, but even so you can't have forgotten your fight at the old Shillelagh the other day." "I don't think I'm going to be allowed to forget it," I sighed. "Well, I tell you what, sir. I'm just going to come straight out with it, because you look like a young man who knows his own mind, and is unlikely to be persuaded one way or the other by anything I might have to tell you. Have you ever thought of going to sea?" "Well, now that you come to mention it, Mr. Wallace, I had once considered leaving Bristol and heading in that direction. You're right." "So what's stopping you?" I shook my head. "Now that is a very good question. Do you know what a privateer is, Mr. Kenway, sir?" Before I could answer, he was telling me. "They're buccaneers given letters of marque by the Crown. You see, the Dons and the Portuguese are helping themselves to the treasures of the New World. They're filling their coffers, and it's the job of privateers either to stop them or to take what they're taking. Do you understand?" "I know what a privateer is, thank you very much, Mr. Wallace. I know that you can't be put on trial for piracy so long as you don't attack ships belonging to your own country. That's it, isn't it?" "Oh, that's it, Mr. Kenway, sir," grinned Dylan Wallace. "How would it be if I leaned over and was to help myself to a mug of ale? That'd be stealing, wouldn't it? The barman might try to stop me. But what if I was doing it with impunity? What if my theft had the royal seal of approval? This is what we're talking about, Mr. Kenway. The opportunity to go out on the high seas and help yourself to as much gold and treasure as your captain's ship will carry. And by doing so, be not only working with the approval of Her Majesty Queen Anne, but helping her. You've heard of Captain Christopher Newport, Francis Drake, Admiral Sir Henry Morgan. Privateers all. How about adding the name Edward Kenway to that illustrious list?" "What are you saying?" "I'm saying, how about becoming a privateer, sir?" I gave him a studying look. "And if I promise to think about it, what's in it for you?" "Why, commission, of course. Don't you normally press gang men for this kind of thing?" "Not men of your calibre, Mr. Kenway. Not men we might consider officer material." "All because I showed promise in a fight?" "Because of the way you conducted yourself in that fight, Mr. Kenway. In all aspects of it." I nodded. "If I promise to think about it, does that mean I don't need to return the favour of an ale?" 8. I went to bed that night knowing I had to tell Father my destiny lay not in sheep farming, but in swashbuckling adventure as a privateer. He'd be disappointed, of course, but maybe